Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another review of a Challenge spinoff season, and here I'll be talking about the Challenge USA Season 2, another Challenge season mostly comprising of people from the CBS reality shows, namely Big Brother, Survivor, and The Amazing Race. Again, a concept I love when Season 1 was announced. I'll say I was extremely worried when this season was announced, especially when we found out that they were adding in a few MTV legends this time. Which, while their inclusion was disappointing at first, I actually do think it kind of played out for the better on this season, having these established vets, but having them play from the bottom, which led to this interesting dynamic on the season, and surprising just as a whole, this ends up being a pretty solid season, where again, I came into it with really low expectations, considering my low opinion on the current state of the franchise, and also with how random this cast seemed to be on paper, and also the fact that it seemed like CBS themselves didn't even want to air the show, where originally it was going to be relegated on Paramount Plus until the writer's strike, and even after that I was given a 10 p.m. time slot with 2 episodes a week and then a mid-season shakeup, and again just felt like CBS just did not care about this show in the slightest. But again, I come out of this thinking it's probably one of the better modern Challenge seasons, definitely an improvement upon Season 1, and almost definitely better than a lot of the most recent mainline seasons. Anyway, like my other reviews, obviously I will be running through my thoughts on the season from beginning to end, and let's start off with the premiere. And initially we do see the players being ridden on boats, initially just including the CBS players with a lot of representation from Big Brother and Survivor, but only 2 from The Amazing Race, which is just pathetic. Where again, it's like, if you're gonna do this format, at least try to put more Amazing Race people. I mean, as is, with so little Amazing Race people on here, you're just putting them as very easy people to be picked off early on. But here we do get Dusty and Lewis, where we do get content from them early on. Dusty talking about how he's a Challenge super fan, how much this experience means to him, while Lewis talks about how he's such a blatant underdog, and what do you know, that pretty much sums up both of their storylines on this season. But also while here, we do also see that Paulie Calafiore is on board the ship, with him actually getting the first confessional of the season, talking about how he used to be a boy and now he's a man, and this is his long-awaited return. And straight up, Paulie's return here was probably the casting choice I was the most excited to see on this season, where Paulie is someone that, again, you can hate him. Again, it's very understandable to hate him, but I feel like he's someone that is fun to hate. I feel like his runs on the mainline show, while filled with some terrible behavior, are also still filled with pretty great TV, with him constantly picking fights and just outright also just being a solid Challenge competitor. Again, for him to return here, I was definitely very excited, though straight up his return played out a lot differently than I expected. But we do right away see his rivalry with Josh, where he talks about how he hasn't talked to Josh in 4 years, and again, it gets set up as if this is going to be this major storyline on the season, only for it to not really be that big of one. Anyway, we also get a confessional here from Sebastian for some reason. He's here. That's a bizarre casting choice. I don't know why of all people in Survivor history they decided to pick Sebastian from Survivor Ghost Island, with him, I believe, being the newbie from the furthest back season here, which again, it's like, why? But then we also get a confessional from Chris Underwood, who was also a really interesting casting choice here, kind of in the opposite way. I mean, it was random to a degree, but also someone that I was kind of pleasantly surprised to see here, as he states here, he obviously won Survivor, despite getting voted out, and through that, it kind of leads to this interesting dynamic with him on this season, of him clearly wanting redemption, of wanting to prove himself as a player, considering obviously most people don't look at his win too favorably. And again, for him to just kind of come out of nowhere to being on a Challenge season, I thought was a pretty interesting prospect here. Anyway, we have the players arriving at the port with TJ there, who talks about this is going to be a season about risk-taking, and ends up revealing the Hopper, this device that will randomly decide a lot of the game's events, which I will say, isn't that not risk-taking? Isn't it just putting everything to luck? But whatever. We get the reveal that the game will be played in teams, which I was happy to see back. I mean, we don't see the team format that often in Modern Challenge, and I was happy to see here, though we do get the Hopper picking 3 captains here, to where the 3 picked end up being Josh, Cassidy, and Desi. Though Desi ends up getting her first confessional here, talking about last time she made the final and her partner quit, and this time she wants redemption. And we even get this random confession from Dusty talking about how how strong of a partner she would be, which doesn't lead to anything, though this obviously is a great introduction for Desi, one that made her come off as a pretty obvious potential winner from right away. But before the teams get picked here, we have TJ revealing one more surprise, with 6 more players arriving on jet skis, to which it obviously turns out to be the MTV Vets, which was not a surprise. I mean, I'm pretty sure they obviously knew that they were going to be joining the game, but either way, we do get kind of a random grouping here, where obviously we get these more established vets that are on a lot of modern seasons, from the likes of Bananas, Wes, Tori, but then we also get some other more interesting picks. We get Corey, someone that's been gone for a little bit, so interesting that he comes back for USA. We get the return of Amanda, obviously great TV, and someone that has a very hostile relationship with the likes of a Tori and even a Bananas, to where that's an interesting dynamic to add here. And then we also get John A, who again has been on a lot of recent seasons, but interesting to put her on USA. And I think just in general, this was a pretty good grouping of MTV vets. Well, again, I would have rather not had Tori or Bananas. I love that they didn't just go and pick a group of friends, adding in the likes of a Jordan, Nani, Anissa, these people that have been running recent seasons, and through that, these picks weren't actually that bad. And we do get some pretty nice intros to them too, to where they end up using footage from their original shows, which was a nice callback. But anyway, we obviously get to the teams getting picked, where Josh ends up leading the red team, to where he ends up surprisingly picking John A as his first pick, while also later picking Paulie to keep his enemies close, which really, I think Josh plays this pick pretty well, picking these people that he's not super close to, which essentially obviously forces the people that he's not super close to try to bond with him as they're on the same team together, but also keeping his allies on other teams, to where when they end up winning challenges and have to make decisions, they're going to make decisions that don't disfavor him. And again, I think overall he plays this pretty well. Though the team here does end up being a bit of a mess, to where they end up declaring themselves the red flag team, and ends up containing Josh, Paulie, and Bananas. So this very hostile relationship there. Anyway, we get the blue team, which was led by Cassidy, to where she surprisingly picks Corey as her first pick, to where it's funny that she says she picks him due to him not having the ego that Wes and Bananas have, only for him to then laugh at Bananas and Wes for not getting picked. But really, this is a team that came off as the most solid right off the bat, having a decent mix of established vets and promising newcomers that definitely made this feel like the strongest team right away. But then we also get the green team, which was led by Desi, and really this ends up being a pretty big underdog team here, comprising of a lot of the lesser connected people. And really Desi kind of also gets screwed by the draft order here as well, where due to every team needing 2 vets, she's essentially forced to pick Amanda by the end of it, and then also gets the last guy in Lewis. So overall, her picks didn't turn out too great here. But anyway, we then get to the arrival at the house, which ends up actually being a house this time and not a bunker, so at least there's that. But right away, we get some setup to some drama with Amanda not liking Tori or Michelle, with the Michelle rivalry being a bit strange, as it's set up here as they don't like each other because Michelle hooked up with Fessy, while Amanda also hooked up with Fessy, which is like, she's not even with Fessy anymore, so like, why does she care that much? But to be fair, it's Amanda, so even though this rivalry doesn't make sense, it at least still makes for great TV. Anyway, we then also get introduced to Amira, who talks about how she's aligned with Monty and Alyssa S, which I wonder if that's going to end up mattering in a little bit. But then we also get introduced to Tyler, who I thought was a pretty big get here. While Tyler might not be the most riveting TV, I do think Tyler is someone that kind of just fits the challenge, and I think seeing him here, especially after Angela was on the previous season, was also a pretty big shock, especially considering how negative experience it was for Angela, though we obviously see him talk about his breakup with Angela and talk about how he's not going to give in to temptation this time, only for us to get a shot of Alyssa S, which is clear foreshadowing. Anyway, this all takes us to the first daily, which is a strange one, of the teams having to carry statues of the challenge vets up to a castle and have them memorize symbols along the way, during which Tori ends up making a joke that people found funny of how Fessy's upset we're not carrying a statue of him, which I just found to be forced humor there from Tori, but the challenge itself ends up being fine. I mean, we do get this fun little moment of the red team trying to pass the blue team, being upset that they're blocking the way, only for them to then lose their statue in the process, creating this big mess, which pretty much exemplifies the red team. Oh, while the green team is actually in the lead, coming to checkpoint 2, only for them to mess up the puzzle because Amanda forgot the symbols, to which they end up coming in last instead. And we do get a pretty close race at the very end, where both the red and blue teams are at the very top. The blue ends up winning here. But anyway, this is where we get the reveal of the format, which initially is typical fare here, where obviously the winning team will be safe and they get to vote in one man and one woman from either of the two losing teams to be at risk for elimination. And kind of what you would expect, but it is the next aspect of this that does shake it up quite a bit, and it's something I do really like here, and the fact that players from the losing teams here will now have to secretly vote for any person on either of the losing teams. However, unlike typical formats where the person with the most votes will automatically be put in, instead, what's going to happen is that each vote will then be represented by one ball inside of the hopper, so they'll do a random draw for who goes into elimination, which I really like. Now, yes, it's adding an added element of luck to the game, something that is obviously not ideal. However, I think it really shakes up the formula here and how people play the game, and that even having just one enemy in the game can cause you to be thrown into elimination, and obviously just makes it for the majority to not just simply get their way every time. And I think just in general, this format led to a lot of fun results across the season. Though something I didn't love about all this is that the hopper also essentially decides which gender goes into elimination as well, which through that can obviously lead to an imbalance of men and women later on in the game, which again, that's not ideal. Now I will say it did actually add a interesting level of strategy to the game as well, where that obviously influences whose name you end up voting in, as if you want it to be a men's elimination, you'll add a man's name, while otherwise obviously a woman's name. Again, it is this interesting dynamic, though it's still like an added level of randomness that I didn't particularly love. But anyway, we follow this up with more strong content from Josh, where again, a lot of people like to criticize Josh and strategic play, but again, I think once again, he does have some pretty solid play here, and him instantly creating an alliance with the blue team, telling them that he wants to work together. Now, obviously, it's easier for him to do considering he has a lot of friends on the blue team, but still, this ends up creating this alliance between the red and blue teams that really ends up lasting for pretty much the entire team phase of the game. Though again, the fact that the green team is largely filled with lesser connected people does obviously make it a lot easier for that to come together. But again, we get to the nominations where right away the blue team is instantly talking about working with the red team due to this notion, though it does leave the two Alyssas really upset, as most of their allies are on the green team, or despite the blue team later being able to make moves against the vets in future episodes, in this episode they seem to just kind of relent in letting Amira and Lewis be the targets, kind of these easy targets on the board, with Amira being targeted, obviously upsetting Alyssa S, as she considers her best friend. And I did find it kind of funny that Alyssa S was literally crying over Amira being voted in, only for Amira to just be upset at Alyssa when she first hears about this. But anyway, we then get to the secret vote where the entire red team agrees to be voting for a green team member, showing initially this team loyalty that doesn't really stick for much beyond this episode. But it's in this moment where we get talk from Janae about her not trusting Michelle due to Wes telling her that she's an emotional player, which felt kind of weird, as I mean, Wes has never played with Michelle up to this point. And even beyond that, from what I understand, Michelle is a friend of Wes's wife, to where it's kind of weird that he would directly target her in this way. But either way, that does lead to Janae voting for Michelle, which ends up being a questionable move, where a lot of people talk about this as the reason why Janae ends up being voted in episode 2, though really I don't feel like that's the case. While obviously it did not really work in her favor in any way, I don't think it was this massive disadvantage to her game either. But obviously she did make this move, assuming that the votes were not going to be revealed in any way, and while obviously the individual vote of who voted for who wasn't revealed, just the total number of votes were, which does end up revealing that one red member did not go through with the plan, with Michelle getting 3 votes here and instantly noting that someone from her team must have voted for her. Though really most of the votes end up going to men here, particularly Monty and Bananas, which again plays into the interestingness of the hopper, and that despite that, Michelle ends up getting thrown in, which I should mention that episode 1 does actually end on a cliffhanger before the draw is revealed, which I think is kind of stupid. Though part of that comes from the fact that this was declared as a 2-part premiere, and sure, again, I think this adds more credence to the fact that this was going to be released on Paramount Plus, where this is a similar strategy that was utilized with Challenge World Championship, where the first 2 episodes were released on premiere day, and it feels like this was another instance of that, where this was planned to be episodes 1 and 2 released at the same time, though because of obviously the schedule of it being on CBS, they were released separately. But anyway, we do start off episode 2 with the elimination between Michelle and Amira, which again was a pretty shocking result considering there were 12 men names in the hopper and only 4 women. But we do instantly get some bickering between Amanda and Michelle, with Amanda cheering when Michelle gets voted in, and Michelle yelling "fuck you" back at her. But the actual elimination here was actually pretty bad. Not the initial concept, but I think just the execution here and the fact that it is this challenge where players are being dunked into a tank 15 times, a tank that has 1,500 balls in it, and the goal is to get as many balls out over the course of the 15 dunks, which is, again, just not good TV. It's very hard to follow. Really, most of this challenge ended up coming down to a montage. Again, I think it would have been a lot better if it was simply just get all the balls out of the tank. Now, I understand why they didn't want to do more than the 15 dunks, as obviously it seemed to be pretty rough on them even as is, but then, like, why not just do the 15 dunks and then after that it's just get all the balls out? Like, overall, I just feel like it's elimination that was just kind of dull. But we do see Michelle barely winning here over Amira, where I guess we might as well talk about her here. And Amira, again, didn't really do much on the season, and there's really not that much to say about her. She was simply there, gets targeted, seemingly just due to her being not that well connected on the green team, and really didn't even get that much content on the show. So while Amira was someone that I definitely thought had some potential coming into it, she never really got much of a chance, and it's not really that big of a shocker that she's out first. Now let's continue with the rest of episode 2, where Michelle does end up getting something for winning the elimination. That is the power to defect, which is something we've seen on a lot of modern seasons, especially ones that do have teams or duos where you're able to switch teams if you win the elimination, though Michelle doesn't end up going through with it here. But instantly, as we get back to the house, we do get our first big fight of the season between Michelle and Amanda, where again, Fessy's just sitting in the background as they argue over him, which, I mean, this was a mostly standard fight here, though it did seem like the CBS players were like kind of shocked by the drama here, which was kind of humorous. And it's also funny that immediately after this fight, we then get personal content for Amanda with her talking about how all that matters to her is her son, and again, just kind of funny the humanization of her immediately after her getting into a fight. But it's also funny that we get conversation between some of the women where they seem to figure out the fact that Janae was the vote against Michelle, which again, I don't think really mattered to anything at all. It seems like by the end of this episode, a lot of the talk was that they wanted to target the vets, and Janae and Tori were the only vets vulnerable by the end of the episode, where obviously they were going to get voted in. So while the show tries to prop this up as a bad move from Janae and one that ended her game, I don't really feel like that was the case. But it is in this instance where the group that ends up piecing this together ends up being this alliance that, again, doesn't really get a proper introduction to the following episode, but it is the Secret Garden Alliance. This alliance that really seems to be running things early on in this season, with it really being an alliance that's this mix of the Survivor and Big Brother women, with the core of it being Tiffany, Desi, Chanel, and Michaela, with the Alyssas being brought in by Tiffany, and Michelle being brought in by the Survivor women, being, again, this alliance of 7 women that kind of seemed to be a faulty alliance from the very beginning, considering the fact that obviously they don't have many other women to target. So how long is this alliance really going to last? But also strangely doesn't include the likes of like a Cassidy, who's also a Survivor woman, and kind of just feels like a random grouping to come together here. But either way, we do follow this up with an interesting confessional from Corey talking about how Michelle, Josh, and Fessy have a lot of connections in the house, which I guess is where I should mention the fact that, yeah, some of these players are players that do have connections to both the CBS side of things and the MTV side of things, where, again, the likes of Michelle, Josh, and Fessy are also prominent competitors on the MTV challenge, while also obviously having roots in CBS. And through that, it ends up giving them a pretty big advantage in this game, allowing them to play the middle very early on, which obviously was unfair, though I don't think it really makes that major of a negative impact on the season. But anyway, we then get to the daily, which ends up being working the polls, a challenge where you have to get your team from one side of the platform to the other while crossing a whole bunch of hanging poles. And I thought this was a fun enough challenge, seeing these teams have to work together, to which we do end up seeing Bananas do a pretty good job at advising his team, telling him the optimal strat here, really showing you the strengths of Bananas on the challenge, though at the same time, it doesn't really work out for him. As almost right away, you do see Michelle drop, to which we do get a funny confessional from Amanda, calling her a wet dog. And we do have Amanda surprisingly getting all the way through, during which we do see Michelle saying that she hopes she falls. And like once Amanda does make it, she ends up flicking the others off, which all that's really fun. And really just the green team does extremely well here, where Desi ends up making it as well and ends up pulling up Tyler by his legs, which is pretty impressive. Once we get to round 2, we again still get more of the drama surrounding Amanda with her cheering once Tori ends up falling. And we do get a funny little moment of Josh just slowly falling from his pole and Bananas mocking him in confessional, which is also kind of funny. They give Josh this dodo content when his entire storyline on this season is about how he's in the best shape he's ever been. But again, Desi ends up running again for this heat and ends up leading them to victory here, which is all really impressive. But with the green team having won here, it's pretty clear they're going to go after the vets, especially considering, again, how unconnected this group is. So we have them clearly trying to get a Tori versus Janae elimination. To where we do start to get a decent amount of content surrounding Tori, with her trying to repair a relationship with Amanda and talking about how she has to work with her, though I don't think it was ever really going to work from Amanda's point of view. Well, also, we get showmance content between Sebastian and Tori, which is weird, especially considering how Tori was clearly not into him at all. Tori talks about how attracted he is to her personality, only for her to say thank you. But anyway, we get to nominations where, again, Desi's leading the charge and trying to get Bananas and Tori voted in, to where Wes does try to fight back, only for Michaela to completely undercut his argument, which was funny to see, really starting this Wes versus Michaela rivalry that we see end up being a pretty humorous storyline across the season. But Wes ends up being completely outnumbered here, and Tori and Bananas end up being voted in. Well, then we get to the secret vote, which we do have some interesting strats happening here, to where blue team ends up agreeing to vote for a guy to try to keep Tori safe, while Tiffany also ends up voting for a guy against her alliance's wishes, as she wants to keep Janae safe as well, only for all that to not really matter, as while the votes are really scattered, Janae still ends up getting 5 votes here and does get picked by the Hopper. So we do get a pretty big elimination here. Again, Tori versus Janae are 2 really massive names here, though it ends up being an extremely physical comp, one that has them having to catch a ball and wrestle for it, which is a challenge just such in Tori's wheelhouse. So they really just montage through a lot of it, but clearly Tori ends up beating Janae here. I think the first time in a while that Janae has been properly eliminated. Really the first time since she's come back from her hiatus. Though also not that big of a surprise, where I've kind of mentioned this in the past with Janae, where Janae feels like a competitor that's perfectly suited for something like All-Stars. Though I do think in comparison to the best of the best on the mainline show, I do think she's a bit outclassed, especially from a physical perspective. I feel like this was kind of an example of that. But anyway, losing Janae here was definitely a big loss for a season. Again, I do really like Janae, especially more than the likes of Tori, to where I would have much rather had her stay in the game. I think it would have been interesting to see her play with the CBS people, where it seemed like she was building some relationships, especially with like a Tiffany, and also just seems to play the game in a way similarly to how the CBS players like to play. They're obviously being a somewhat dynamic strategic player, but again, her actually getting eliminated early here is not that big of a surprise, though definitely a disappointment though. Either way, with that we get to episode 3, which starts off with more Tori versus Amanda content, where Amanda tells her that I'll never be your friend, and is just openly pissed that Janae didn't win the elimination, which is again fun content from her. Though following this, we got more content from the rookies talking about wanting the challenge vets gone, and through that we do get content from Corey talking about while his closest ally is Fessy, he does want to work with the other vets in Bananas and Wes, which I wonder if that'll be relevant later on. Speaking of that, we also get content from Paulie here, who gets strong content here. I mean, this is radically different content than I was expecting to get from Paulie, but he does end up talking about his sexuality and how he had previously been suppressing it due to him feeling this need to be more alpha, and talked about how he's in the best headspace in his life, obviously just coming out as bisexual, which I'm happy that Paulie's gotten to this point in his life, that he's recognized the negativity that surrounded his previous action, and that he's obviously just accepted being himself, which again, really uplifting content here. Definitely not what I was expecting from Paulie coming into the season. Really the complete opposite, but still like good content despite that. Where I still think no matter what, like Paulie is still a very cutthroat player and one that is going to play the game hard. But now he can do that without this bit of ickiness surrounding him and how terribly he treats people. I do think it can lead to him still being interesting TV down the road. But obviously this being here in this part of the episode made it very clear that he was probably going to elimination. And with that, we do get to the daily, which ends up being kind of an interesting comp here of them having to capsize their own boat to see the puzzle combination and then find all the flags and put them in order. Again, kind of a different comp here, but one that the blue team ends up pretty easily winning. Though through this comp, we do get a lot of setup to Bananas being in danger if his team loses, to which Alyssa Lopez ends up talking about how she's not going to sit back anymore and that she's going to try to flip Corey on the vets, to which he ends up talking about how he's not going down with a sinking ship, leading to nominations, where it seemed like the group was pretty resolute in wanting a guy elimination, which is again kind of an interesting aspect of this format, is that them having to think about if they want want a man or a woman to go in and how that affects who they pick. And we do get another great moment from Alyssa Lopez where Tori ends up talking about how the other sides are coming after her, only for Alyssa Lopez to then say it's not always about you. Which I will say, while Alyssa's run on this season was relatively short, I did find her to be really good TV, especially in these moments of her being very anti-vet. Anyway, most people end up voting for Bananas here, with Corey jumping on board, which again is propped up as this big betrayal, but like Bananas was getting voted in anyway. Though from the women's side of things, it is definitely a lot more mixed, so Amanda gets voted in there. To which Tori is instantly upset how her voice meant nothing in this vote. Which again, I love seeing Tori not getting her way, especially after the recent mainline seasons of her just easily finding her way in the majority there. Anyway, we do have Tori telling Bananas what happened and that Fessy and Corey betrayed them. To which we get this pretty big fight here between Bananas and Corey and Fessy, where he instantly calls Corey out. Which all this is a pretty funny fight, especially considering how Corey has clearly lost his voice and can barely talk while Bananas is yelling at him. Then we also have Bananas calling out Fessy, saying you're a bitch too, only for Fessy to fight back, saying I'm tired of your shit and I don't owe you anything. You know, this is pretty fun to see the vets bickering here. And again, Alyssa Lopez getting great content once again, saying, cry me a river. And you get this funny editing here of Bananas just really going on this massive spiel that gets montaged. And we have Chris mocking him in confessional, saying at first that this is subtle manipulation, and then saying, wait, no, this is obvious manipulation. And really, this ends up leaving Bananas kind of on an island at this point, with him really only having Dusty and Paulie as allies, which is this humorous spot to be in, of him having Dusty, this guy that talks about how Bananas is his hero and he just wants to be Johnny Bananas, while the other guy is a guy that hated his guts until the beginning of this season. But anyway, the plan is obviously to have Bananas go in, to which Paulie ends up getting this content about teaming up with Bananas, and we get this montage of their history. Though I believe the rumblings were that Paulie volunteered to go in against Bananas, which kind of like nullifies the storyline. But either way, we do also have a red team meeting where they talk about who they want to vote in, which ends up having a humorous little moment of Amanda piping up at one point, only for the realization that what is she doing here, considering she's not even on the red team. But also this meeting ends up leading to a weird conclusion where they agree on voting in Tyler at first, though by the time we get to the actual vote, it seems like a lot of them end up voting for Monty instead. So we also get a confessional from Bananas about how he wants to go against Monty to make a statement, even though he was saying in this meeting that he wanted to go against Tyler. So again, all this is kind of weird. But anyway, all but one vote ends up being for a guy, to which it's never even explained who ends up voting for Chanel here. But despite Monty getting the most votes of the bunch, Paulie is the one that gets picked here, which again, having a Bananas versus Paulie elimination is pretty insane this early on. It ends up being an elimination that is actually pretty apt for their relationship, and the fact that it's actually the same elimination they went up against each other in Final Reckoning, of it kind of being this modification of the When It Rains It Pours competition from Survivor, of you having to hold your hand up when it's connected to a bucket. Though there's an added wrinkle here of you standing on a block of ice, and that by hitting a target in front of you, it'll turn on a fire underneath the ice, which will melt the ice block, making it hard to keep your arm up. An interesting aspect to all this, though, I didn't love the aspect of once you're out of bags, that's it. And through that leaves it in a situation where once both of them run out of their bags and Paulie is the one that still has the fire on underneath him, that obviously just means that Paulie's gonna lose, and all that felt kind of anticlimactic. But Paulie ends up leaving here kind of in this weird spot to where, again, it's in something that I never thought would ever happen. We see Paulie crying over Bananas telling him that he's a good competitor, which, again, if you were to tell me Paulie would even care about what Bananas thought of him coming into this, I'll be mind blown. But this ends up being another episode that ends on a bit of a cliffhanger, where Bananas obviously now has a choice of whether or not to defect, to where, obviously by the fact that they decide to make this a cliffhanger, and we literally end the episode with Corey saying that he's worried that he's going to switch with him, it literally just outlines what's going to happen here. But anyway, we do lose Paulie in episode 3, which again was a pretty big loss to me. I was pretty excited to see Paulie back, and while he didn't turn out to be the same character as he was last time, I do feel like he still ended up being pretty interesting TV for while he was there. And I do think it's a shame that he was out this early, as I do think if he was still in the game moving forward, he probably would have played the game very hard. I think it would have been interesting to see how he handled his position in the middle, but really that was all for naught. But again, I would personally still love to see Paulie on future seasons. I still think he's a player that's going to play very hard, and one that is still a pretty good competitor, to where I would not be shocked if on return he makes a deep run like he used to. But with that, we move on to episode 4, where what do you know? Bananas defects and swaps out with Corey. Who would have guessed? They'll finally ends up saying he's doing this because Red isn't going to win shit, which obviously ages very well. This leads up to this pretty funny moment of Dusty being upset to lose Bananas, to where Bananas ends up finding a note that Dusty left in his bag, talking about how much he's going to miss Bananas, which is this kind of ridiculous moment, but one that was really funny TV. But following this, we do get a decent amount of content from Josh, who talks about still being aligned with the vets and wants to target the likes of Lewis and Desi, to which he ends up confronting them to their faces, which Lewis in particular is shocked about. And while at first you're thinking, okay, this is just typical Josh of him getting upset at people for no reason, I do feel like this still came off as a more measured Josh than what we would typically see, with him seeming to rationalize this strategically in the confessional. But following this, we do end up getting some content from Desi, who ends up getting some pretty humanizing content here, talking about how other people have more faith in her abilities than she does, and that she's always had issues with self-esteem, and talks about how she's a ball of emotions. And again, all this was pretty strong content for Desi. Definitely not what you expected from Desi, but also kind of spoiled that Desi's going to play a major role in the episode moving forward. But anyway, we then get to the daily, which was not the most riveting TV here, at least on paper. It was a challenge that was kind of hard to follow on who was exactly doing well, but it does lead to somewhat interesting results where it quickly becomes a race between the red and the green teams, the blue team falling out of it, and through that, Chris decides to create a plan to block out the green team so that the red team will win. Something that seems very beneficial to the blue team, considering the fact that the red and blue teams have a really close connection, though at the same time, I don't fully get why Chris is doing this. Like, while it's a good idea on paper to give your allies the win, it's also making a big target of himself to where, as we do later see, this essentially makes it guaranteed that he's going to be the guy that gets the most votes coming into the hopper. So again, I felt like this is kind of a misguided plan. But we do see the blue team really going all in on this, with Bananas just instantly dropping all of his chips as the round starts, to kind of just throw it in their faces, which really feels like the most Bananas thing that he could do. Anyway, obviously the red team ends up winning, which just ends up being a pretty big win, as we do learn that this is a double elimination, where red team will end up nominating both a man and a woman, both of which are guaranteed to go into elimination, while everyone else will vote for one man and one woman themselves, which again is an interesting shakeup to the formula here. We do finally see right away Michelle talking strat with the Secret Garden Alliance, talking about how they need to make sure that they fight for Desi and Lewis, and make sure that's Amanda and Wes that go in, which I'm sure will happen, as we then cut to Josh talking about how he knows the team is 3v3 and that he's okay going into a stalemate. And this does lead to the nominations, which are just a complete mess, but really great TV despite that, where right away they do at least agree on voting in a green team member, as obviously the blue team did help them. But Michelle obviously instantly wants Amanda, only for Josh to completely neglect that, saying he wants Desi, to which Tiffany, Chanel, and Michelle all say no to Desi, leading to Josh really lashing out here, causing Josh to tell them that they should be wanting Desi out as they can't beat her in a final, which, I mean, to be fair, it's kind of true, even though obviously it's way too early to be making a move like that now. But Josh really ends up fighting hard here, saying that he has nothing to lose, and when he wants them to throw out another girl's name, and Tiffany naming Cassidy, only for Chanel to instantly say no. We have Josh really freaking out here, and what's a pretty funny moment, and him saying, "Are we playing Survivor's Game now?" And we get Chanel calling him unhinged, though it actually seems to be somewhat effective, as when we get to the votes, he surprisingly ends up getting his way here, where Tiffany ends up voting for Cassidy, causing a 3-2-1 vote for Desi, with Desi getting voted in there. While on the guy side of things, Lewis is again the front runner there, with Dusty being upset they're voting an Amazing Race person, only for him to then not really even try to save Lewis by voting for Monty when no one else was voting for Monty. But even beyond that, we have Michelle also flipping her vote to take out Lewis, really showing this complete breakdown of the Secret Garden Alliance and them really not doing anything that they plan on doing coming into this, with Chanel being the only person to really stick true to the alliance. And we do get some great reactions to the vote results here, with Lewis being upset at Dusty for not protecting him, while also we get Amanda saying that she's the luckiest girl alive by not being voted in, which again felt like a bit quick for her to be saying that. And we do get some fun bickering immediately afterwards, where Tiffany is upset at Michelle for not voting in Wes, all while again Tiffany is the reason why Desi got voted in. So it's funny that these two people people that are the reasons why the plans didn't go through on 2 different votes are upset at each other for not sticking to the plan. But anyway, we have the green team talking about who to vote in, where they obviously agree on voting in Chris as the person that did come up with the plan to make them lose, which again is why it's a misguided play from Chris. Though also, initially they end up agreeing on voting in Cassidy as well, only for Desi to talk about how she needs to take control of her game and ends up getting her alliance to flip the vote onto Amanda as someone that she thinks she could beat easier, with Wes not getting the memo there and them really just blindsiding Wes for the sake of it, I guess. That seemed kind of misguided. But also, Michaela ends up just straight up voting for Wes in this instance, which is just kind of humorous as well. Simply because she doesn't like that he's getting his way, which is like, is he getting his way? But either way, kind of funny though. But anyway, we get to the elimination. Well, right away you could tell it's going to be a physical one, with it being Evil Eyes, essentially just a modification of pole wrestle. But through that, the votes here end up being pretty heavily weighted, where Chris ends up getting 6 votes, while Amanda gets a pretty shocking 9 votes. To which even TJ's laughing when he ends up seeing that, though both of them get drawn to play here. Now, the portrayal of this elimination was a bit strange. The fact that it was clearly a 2 out of 3 style elimination, yet they only showed 1 run. By the way, the Chris versus Lewis one was a pretty brutal one, with them really flipping around quite a bit, though Chris ends up winning there. Well, in the Desi versus Amanda elimination, I mean, Amanda had no real shot, though she actually does do surprisingly well, but Desi doesn't win anyway, meaning that we do lose Lewis and Amanda. But before the end of the episode, we obviously still get the decision on defecting, to where Chris decides to stay on the blue team while Desi does defect, switching with Alyssa S, making the blue team pretty stacked at this point, while also kind of leaving the green team pretty underpowered, now being short on people and also not having the greatest people, though their loss of numbers kind of end up working out for them in the next episode at least. But either way, before moving on, obviously let's talk about the boots. Starting off with Lewis, who was fine. I mean, Lewis is a really likable guy. I really like Lewis on The Amazing Race. I think The Amazing Race is definitely more of the show for him, though, than The Challenge. But again, he was still likable here. He didn't get that much content, though, and really, as a whole, didn't really feel like he stood much of a chance. To where while he's fine competitively, it just felt like he had no real connections here, to where he was just always an easy person to throw in. And then obviously we got Amanda, who is still incredible TV. Amanda's great. I would love it if Amanda was just on every season. I think she brings a lot of drama. And while she isn't that good at the challenges themselves, she, again, is at least going to bring it TV-wise. So she's someone that I still found pretty fun on this season. But now we move on to episode 5, where we do get some pretty interesting reactions to the previous episode. We do end up having Chris coming back to the house, being pissed off at Tyler and Monty for voting him in, to which we get this really awkward fight, where you can kind of tell that Chris was kind of trying to repeat what he saw in the other fights on the season. There's does it very awkwardly. So he like stumbles on his words when he says, "We're going to take all you bitches out." He tells him that this is not like Big Brother. It is really funny where he says, "You're playing like it," and they ask him how, kind of calling out the ridiculousness of the statement. But again, while this is all kind of a bad look for Chris, it actually leads up to, again, decent content for him restating how people look at him as undeserving for his Survivor win and how he wants to prove himself from that. But following this, we do get kind of strange content from the likes of Tori, who talks about how the vets aren't threats anymore and how there's fractions within the newbies. And really the show tries to hype it up as if the vets had anything to do with this, make it seem like they started this Survivor versus Big Brother battle, when in reality that was a battle that was always going to happen, especially once they got to lower numbers. So again, it's kind of weird they end up propping up the vets for this. But following this, we end up getting content from Cassidy, who finds out that Wes was the person that voted for her, and she's obviously annoyed at that. But first, she ends up having some pretty strong content, personal content talking about the loss of her sister, which I'm pretty sure she mentioned on Survivor as well, though this clearly set Cassidy up as someone going into elimination by the end of the episode. Following this, we do get funny content from Wes, who's obviously now annoyed at his team for blindsiding him and lying to his face, which made him voting Cassidy. To which his response to all this is to skinny dip for some reason, talking about how he needs to become the entertainer for some reason. But anyway, this all leads up to the daily, where this ends up being a pretty interesting one. The fact that they have to carry these boxes, have these puzzle pieces, but they don't have to solve the puzzles beyond the first one, as if you solve them, it does give you an advantage of you having to carry less boxes due to having less people. And through that, and also Wes just straight up telling them to not even bother with the puzzles, it does lead to a pretty easy green team win here. And through that, Wes surprisingly has a decent amount of power coming into this nominations, where he obviously wants to target Cassidy, which ends up happening. He wants to target the Survivor players on the blue team, as no survivors gone home yet, which, spoiler, they still won't. But he does end up getting his way here. Now, it's kind of because it also plays into what the majority of the green team wants as well, where really Michaela's the only survivor on the green team at this point. And despite her trying to fight for there not to be survivors being put in, her fighting ends up kind of just being a bit sloppy here, and her saying that she doesn't want 2 survivor players in, as she wants them on the other teams to be keeping her safe, which really just makes it even more likely that the Big Brother players here are going to want to vote in survivor players. And again, right away we see Tyler really wanting Chris to get put in, while Wes wants Cassie put in, and they end up being the noms here. And we do get great reactions for both of them, with Cassie being upset that Tyler and Monty are letting Wes run their games, and ends up calling them out for hiding from her. While we also have Chris getting upset at Tyler when Tyler tells him he's sorry, only for him to say you're not sorry. Again, that was kind of fun. We then also get a club segment to where it's during this where the ladies end up holding a bachelor competition, to which most of the women want Wes to win due to him saying that he's not on their level and he doesn't deserve any of them, to which Cassie's upset that they're letting Wes win for some reason. I mean, obviously, I guess she's just upset at Wes in general, but this is kind of pointless as it's all just a fake game anyway. But this ends up weirdly leading to a confessional from Alyssa Lopez talking about how she doesn't want Cassidy to go home, and mixing that with a confessional talking about how she's here to finish what she did last time. It makes it pretty clear that we're probably getting a Alyssa Lopez versus Cassidy elimination. But before that, we do get more content from Cassidy, with her being in the hot tub with Josh, to where they end up being pretty friendly, and I'm pretty confident Josh wanted to hook up with her, but I'm pretty sure Cassie's in a relationship. But the weird thing though is that they edited this in the preview as if Cassie was gonna hook up with Josh, which is just weird that they would even edit it that way. But also here we do get our first Alyssa and Tyler segment, only for nothing to really happen from it in this episode. But we then get more focus on the vets before we get to the vote, where Bananas ends up telling them that they're now the swing votes, which again, their show tries to prop it up as if they actually did work to get in this position. But here we see them coming up with this plan that, again, they get way too much credit for. This plan in Operation Hat Trick, where essentially all the vets are going to draw random names and vote for random names just to create chaos, which again doesn't really do anything. But when we get to the votes, most of the votes end up being for Tiffany and Dusty, along with Bananas, despite coming out with this plan, not even going through with this plan and voting for Fessy just for the sake of it. But then we get to the vote reveal, where Dusty's upset when he finds out the number of votes he has against him, which will play a factor in the following episode. But shockingly, the person that gets picked from the hopper here is Alyssa Lopez, who only had 1 vote on her from this Operation Hat Trick, which is why they kind of hype it up in the episode, even though it really doesn't play much of a factor outside of this. But what do you know? We do get the Cassidy versus Alyssa Lopez elimination. Elimination that wasn't that interesting. It was them being locked inside cages and having to roll around a course to get flags and then use them to unlock the code to get out of the cage, and it just wasn't that good of TV really. But Cassidy ends up winning here, staying with her team, to which Tiffany is surprisingly really sad at losing Alyssa here, talking about how she's her emotional support in the game, which is bizarre considering where we left their relationship off last season, where they hated each other. But anyway, obviously we lose Alyssa Lopez, which is a pretty big loss here. I think Alyssa Lopez was pretty great on this season. I thought she was great TV, and the fact that she was fighting against the vets, and like game-wise, she seemed to be decently positioned in the game, but just gets really sniped out here by this one singular vote, which, to be fair, again, shows the pros of this format and the fact that you're never safe and that you really need to secure yourself on all bases. But still disappointed to see her getting taken out this early in the season when she seemed to be pretty poised to do well beyond this and was bringing a decent amount to the show. But with that, we move on to episode 6, where right away, Dusty's upset that he got votes, instantly thinking that Tiffany was the one to lead the charge against him. For some reason, don't know why, but he had 4 votes against him, to which his instant thought is that this deal that he made in the previous round, which we get a flashback to, this deal for Alyssa Lopez to not have the Big Brother people vote him in, did not go through, with him thinking that he was double-crossed, with the votes for him coming from Alyssa Lopez, Alyssa Snyder, and Tiffany, which is completely wrong on all of it. And again, the show really shows him as Big Dodo, flashing back to the votes and showing him being wrong. But really, just in general, like, this is dumb. Like, this is 3 votes. You got 4. Also, Alyssa Snyder didn't even vote. She was part of the winning team. So all this was really stupid. And especially when there's such an obvious answer, as we do later see, in that it was the Survivor women that voted for him. To which it makes sense because there's 4 of them. But this does lead to this really weird fight between Dusty and Tiffany. One where, again, we intercut it with this content from Josh talking about how well Operation Hat Trick worked, which is like, it didn't. This has nothing to do with that. So again, this is caused by the votes that weren't part of Operation Hat Trick. So again, the plan like really had nothing to do with this, yet the edit really props it up despite that. Following this, we get more Cassidy versus Wes content, with Wes really getting a major focus in this episode, with him calling his wife back home, who's pregnant, and talking about the pressure that's on him, as this could be his last season, which I get it, and the fact that obviously, yeah, he's about to have a kid. He also is running businesses, but also, it's not going to be his last season, is it? By the way, follow this up with more Tyler and Alyssa content of them hanging out, talking about how happy they are that they're on the same team, which was boring. But again, another just weekly checkup on them. While we then get to the daily, which ends up being a pretty fun one. Ends up being a trivia challenge, but not your typical one where it also has this layer of endurance, but as teams, where they end up having to hold on to this glass panel, and every time they get an answer wrong, it gets steeper. Though again, they have to answer the questions in teams, which led to a lot of funny moments here in that like one specific member of the team would know the answer, yet another one would yell out the wrong answer for no reason, cause them to get it wrong, with the likes of Tori and Dusty being notorious for this, doing that multiple times during this challenge, with Dusty in particular having a funny goof here and him answering a Super Bowl question wrong while Josh knew the answer, only for it to turn out the answer was Dusty's favorite team anyway. And we get the use of Tiffany's "Go to Hell, Dusty" confessional, which is funny considering it's a confessional that was in the preview, and it seems like a confessional that you would think, okay, this would be used during the Dusty Tiffany fight, but no, it's just randomly interspliced in the middle of this challenge. And to make it even funnier about Dusty is also the first one to drop out here, to where Tiffany mocks him, saying, "Where are you going?" And we have Dusty also right before he drops wanting Corey to go grab him to save him, which is funny. But really, this ends up being a pretty easy Blue win, which doesn't even make sense based on what we're shown, where somehow Blue ends up being the team that gets the least answers wrong, despite the fact that we see so many wrong answers from him in the episode. So that was kind of just strange editing there, though Alyssa Snyder ends up being the last standing for the green team, and Tiffany ends up being the last standing for the red team, and they get really propped up in the edit here. But anyway, with the blue team winning, it's a pretty bad spot for Wes, to where he talks about its worst case scenario, and Tori talks about how she's going to try to save him, keyword try. Though really, Bananas and Tori end up having really zero power here, and considering the team is mostly comprised of Survivor players, they end up having the power here instead, where right away Cassidy wants to vote in Wes, while Chris wants to vote in Tiffany in an attempt to get people to vote for a man, so that Wes will go into elimination, and that seems to be the plan that goes through here. So while Wes does then go on a campaign trail to try to get other people to vote for a woman, and that's even getting this massive montage of his one-on-one conversations, we then instantly cut to everyone agreeing to vote in Dusty, which was this fun dodo moment for him, though it's followed up with more personal content for him talking with Bananas about being an upcoming dad, and Dusty telling him that it's going to be the joy of his life. To which we then have a funny little Bananas moment that is such a Bananas moment, of Bananas telling him that he was exactly where Wes was just a few rounds ago, which is like, what are you talking about? Well, Wes even calls him out here, saying, like, you're not an expecting father. But here we have Wes being upset, saying that this will be the last time he'll get to play the challenge, which we then get a confession from Desi calling him out for creating a sob story for himself, which I believe Wes did genuinely get insulted by this, which Wes was probably somewhat genuine in this, but I think he was also probably using it for game as well. But even beyond that, I mean, come on. Wes is going to be on the challenge again. As much as he states that this is probably his last season, I do not believe it for a second. Anyway, we get to the secret vote, where Dusty does end up getting 7 votes here, but surprisingly 4 votes do go towards women, so it seemed like Wes did get some people to work alongside him. But anyway, Dusty still gets picked from the hopper, to which again Tiffany gets some funny confessionals here saying, come on down, you're next to get your ass kicked right out of this game. But the elimination here ends up being a really strange one that has one of the players standing on a log while the other player has to untie wheel pieces. to which they have to crank the person off of the log, and the person that stays on the log the longest wins. And it's just kind of a weird elimination here, especially in how it's portrayed, where first person to go is Wes, which is inherently a massive disadvantage to go first, as obviously you don't know what time you have to beat and what the overall strat is, where Wes does make some simple mistakes from that. You see him going somewhat slow and untangling the wheel while then wasting time trying to use the first wheel, only for him to need to get the second wheel to take Dusty off. While next we see Dusty go, and the editing here is as if Dusty's doing very well, showing him not even try to move the first wheel, saving him time there, and he ends up knocking Wes out almost right away, to where, again, we get a lot of content as if Wes is going to lose. Wes even outwardly just saying he thinks he's going to lose, and we have Bananas going out there to comfort Wes, which seemed like a really hammy moment. But then we get the reveal that it was actually only 37 seconds between the two, to which Wes has won somehow. And again, don't really know how. It's kind of out of left field. And while some people do claim that this was rigged, and to be fair, I would not put it past Challenge Production to do that, I think this is also an instance of it just feeling like everyone else thought that Wes lost. It's kind of tough to really edit around that, so I could see why they kind of portrayed it this way, but it's still a weird way to show this elimination. But once Wes does win here, he does end up switching with Chris on the blue team, which Chris gets decent content here, talking about how this game is about adapting and overcoming, which again felt like winnery content from him, while Wes, now switching over to the blue team, really ends up making the blue team this very stacked team, one that's filled with challenge vets at this point, that really ends up shifting the power structure on that group and seemingly giving the vets a decent amount of leverage in the game at this point. But anyway, with that, we do end up losing Dusty, who I thought brought some decent TV here. Now, was he the most likable figure on the season? No. But again, he picked fights most of the time for no reason. That was fun. His obsession with Bananas was also really funny. And do I think he played the season that well? Do I think he's that good of a competitor? No. But I thought he brought some intrigue to the season, though, where, well, I don't know if I need to see him on another season. I do think for his role on this season, he was actually decent enough TV. But then we move on to episode 7, where we do start it all off with Wes still holding a pity party for himself, talking about how all he wanted was to play a fair game and how he's upset that he wasn't given the chance, to which Fessy instantly calls us out as no one should be buying this speech, only for us to cut to Alyssa S. talking about how she found the speech endearing, which is pretty apt for her perceptions of the game. But then we also get more content around this Wes and Michaela rivalry, with Wes being upset at her for not giving him a chance. Though this really ends up transitioning to pretty decent content for Michaela, with her talking about how she's learned from her previous games, talking about how her godfather just passed away and she wants to make him proud, which, again, screamed out that she was going into elimination. But anyway, we get to the daily, which I thought was a pretty boring one, of players being put into spears and having to use it as a wrecking ball and smash some columns and later do a puzzle, and it was just kind of blah. But the blue team ends up winning here, to which, again, with them having a majority of challenge vets, it ends up really putting them in a power position at this point, where we do see Josh instantly create a plan to try to get Chanel and Michaela in an elimination together, really targeting the Survivor women at this point, while also wanting to use Tyler as a pawn, but then thinking that there's no way that Tyler would be put in. Though this does later transition to content about Tiffany, who's upset that her Survivor allies are getting put in, as she's extremely close to Chanel, Michaela, and Desi, who are the main targets. Though it does also lead to personal content from her, to where she feels like she's the weakest person on her team, but also ends up talking about struggles she's gone through her life. And once again, it just felt like blatant setup to her being in the elimination. But anyway, we get to the nominations, where right away Bananas wants to vote Michaela in as the ringleader of the Survivor Alliance, and the other vets follow suit, really just following along with Josh's previously stated plan, with Tyler also being nominated for the guys, which this does end up leading to a little tiff between Michaela and Josh, with her telling him to keep her name out of his mouth. All while we also get content around Tyler, with Alyssa being worried for Tyler, and we get more content of them bonding, which is boring, though it does lead to a really funny clip, as while they're talking about their breakups, we end up weirdly seeing the clip from BB20 of Tyler talking about Angela smells like a baby, which is like, why did this make the cut? Anyway, we do get a club sequence in this episode, one where Bananas and Wes talk about there's no romance in this house and want to get Tyler and Alyssa to hook up, to where Wes ends up telling Tyler that he'll be voted in if he doesn't kiss Alyssa, leading to them kissing in front of everyone in the club, which, again, good for them, I guess. I like Tyler, especially on BB20, but even then, not the most riveting TV here. But coming into the secret vote, we do get some content from Michelle, with people seeming to catch on to the fact that she's playing all sides and how she's protected by everybody. That doesn't seem to initially play a factor into the episode, though kind of ends up explaining her vote, where she does end up putting her vote onto Tiffany, seemingly as a measure of her simply just being the least connected to Tiffany and her having major connections to most other people, leading to Tiffany getting 2 votes, while Alyssa S also gets 1 vote, which makes it strange when she's happy when she learns that Tyler isn't playing in the elimination, as that essentially means that she's still available to be voted in, but for some reason she didn't care about that. But really, Chanel ends up getting the most votes of the women here, but despite that, Tiffany is the one that gets picked. Again, what a shocker. To which, pretty much right from the beginning, it's considered this like foregone conclusion that Tiffany's gonna lose. And we do get some fighting here. Tiffany calling out the men of the cast for making another girl's day, saying that the men are scared to play, which leads to a little tiff between her and Josh in this instance. But anyway, the elimination ends up being one that has them shooting balls like in basketball while swinging on a pole. And this is one where Michaela just really decimates this. Tiffany gets her first point when Michaela's almost done, and through that, Michaela pretty easily wins this. To which she does end up making a pretty snide remark here of saying that this is what she can do without a partner, which I'm sure Renan is out there really pissed off at this comment. But we do have Michaela here wanting to switch a Tori on the blue team, only for TJ to reveal that she doesn't have a decision to make because the teams are no more. What a shocker. I mean, obviously this is going to happen at some point, especially considering the number of options left for possible nominees is getting very limited. So again, it felt like the right time to break the teams up. But before moving on, let's talk about the boot from this episode. Obviously talking about Tiffany, who was pretty great TV here. I mean, Tiffany is still an all-time great character, has some really funny confessionals, while also being someone that's able to play the game strategically. Again, at the end of the day, I don't think the challenge is really the game for her. I think she's much better suited for Survivor or Big Brother. Because while Tiffany can hold her own at points and challenges, I don't think she's one that's ever going to really win a challenge season. And it seemed like she was even aware of that. Though I was happy to see her back after last season where she was booed so early, and this time actually having a somewhat deep run into the season. But again, someone that wasn't that big of a surprise to be taken out at this point in the game. Now moving on to episode 8, which ends up being an extremely predictable episode here, where right away we get a lot of talk about the OG Big Brother players, with Tyler, Monty, and Alyssa being the only ones left, while Josh and Fessy obviously have connections to the vets, which just made it so clear that Big Brother was going to be in danger here. Mixing that with the fact that we get more of the Alyssa and Tyler relationship, with Alyssa talking about how she's his support system, and made it pretty clear to me that Tyler was also going to go to elimination. But again, at this point, the house is very clearly divided between Big Brother and Survivor, with the vets being able to play the middle. So while Fessy, Josh, and Corey are more aligned with the Big Brother side of things, we do see the likes of Bananas making a relationship with Michaela, where him and Tori are clearly siding with the Survivor side of things. But all this leads up to the daily, which ends up being one that I think typically would be pretty boring, but I think it plays out in a pretty interesting way here, where we do get 4 heats of 4 players, where they essentially have to solve 2 word puzzles, to where the first person to solve both of them ends up winning. And while I think this is actually a pretty unfair challenge here, where it's highly variant on who you're paired up with, where obviously the players in each of the heats can potentially work together. But I think the interesting thing about how it played out here is how each of these heats essentially play out in a different way, where first up we see Fessy, Alyssa, Cassie, and Tyler go, to where obviously this is a very Big Brother heavy group, and through that Cassidy is kind of left on the outs while the others are working together. Though we do have some strange decisions being made here, from Tyler deciding to try to open the lock without even seeing the combination, and Alyssa and Fessy following him to do so, which was weird, where Cassie ends up getting the lock first. But when it comes to the second puzzle, Cassie ends up struggling, to where Fessy ends up helping her, leading to Alyssa win there. So again, kind of an interesting result. We then get Bananas, Michaela, Chanel, and Monty, to where they all end up agreeing to work together, though Bananas ends up finishing first here, and despite him giving the others a clue by saying pause. They end up not piecing together the clue properly, where they end up all struggling there, which is a funny result. We then get Sebastian, Tori, Wes, and Michelle, which has some fun from them agreeing to work together at the very beginning, only for Wes to get it right away and ends up not helping the others. But Tori really ends up dominating the rest of the challenge, also not helping the other two, to where we get this weird line from Sebastian talking about how hot it is that she didn't tell me, which is like, I guess. Then we get the final one where they actually genuinely work together in Chris, Desi, Josh, and Corey, where Chris literally just lets Josh win, which is a strange choice considering Josh is obviously more so on the Big Brother side of things. But I will also say, I also question, at the point that Josh is being handed the win in this, why didn't Desi just go with him? As that way she can also get a decent time as well. Again, I felt like that was a strange decision, but either way, we end up finding out that Tori beat literally everybody else by over 6 minutes, which is kind of weird, as don't know how exactly that happened. But on the men's side of things, we do see Bananas win, to where we then learn that the format is just gonna be the same, but there's individuals now. So again, didn't really shake up too much. And now with Bananas and Tori in power, it does actually end up leading to a kind of lackluster result here, where right away we do see Tori deciding to work with the Survivor women, wanting to gain their favor to keep her safe later in the game, which is an interesting tactic from Tori, and one that, I mean, kind of exemplifies Tori's game and the fact that she does obviously usually work with these other strong competitors, but through that she keeps these strong competitors around for late into the game, where she then most of the time has difficulty beating those stronger competitors, which does bring up this interesting dilemma with her of her gaining long-term safety only for making her path at the very end a lot more difficult, which again, I would prefer for her to make bigger moves along the way, but for Tori's overall brand, I understand why she plays the way she does, even though I just find it boring. But anyway, we get the nominations, where obviously Tori advocates for working with Survivor, and they both agree to vote in Big Brother players. They vote in Tyler and Alyssa, wanting Tyler to be voted in here. But really, Tyler seemingly just volunteers to go in here anyway, about how he wants to keep Alyssa safe, as long as he's not in the elimination with Monty, which I wonder what's going to happen there. The following is we do get a segment at the club, to where despite everyone else going out to the club, we do see Sebastian and Tori staying behind to have a date back in the house, which is weird considering the fact that, again, I didn't feel like Tori was into Sebastian really at all, but this seemingly puts the target on Sebastian's back, where Alyssa talks about how she wants to target Tori's man, when it's like, again, they're not really a thing, it doesn't seem like. But either way, Sebastian is being the target for the Big Brother side of things, where obviously Monty's the target for the Survivor side of things, where the vote ends up being pretty close, with there being only one more Monty vote than Sebastian, while Wes ends up voting for Cassidy because it's Wes being the only vote for a woman in this round. But they obviously try to pretend like Cassidy's actually going in here, but it turns out to just be Monty. And the actual elimination here is a challenge that I feel like we've seen on other shows. It's actually a stacking comp, though. As you move, the platform you're stacking on ends up spinning. Again, a competition that I didn't find that interesting. Though what was kind of interesting about it here is that it does end up lasting 3 hours, and both of them get super close to finishing, though failing at the last second every single time. But eventually Tyler ends up winning here, which again kind of made sense just due to the fact that Tyler was much more prominent in the edit than Monty. But then we lose Monty, who again, I just didn't feel like did much on this season. And Monty was actually my winner pick coming into this season from the men's side of things, and I was very much expecting him to be this dominant physical competitor, and he really just wasn't. He just felt kind of fine. I mean, yeah, he probably was one of the better competitors on the green team, but he really just didn't do much to really stand out here. I feel like he's someone that I don't really need to see on the challenge again. I don't feel like he brought much entertainment. Really, he did not do much for me on this season. But now for episode 9, where right away we get talk about how Big Brother has been in every elimination and that no survivor has gone home yet, with all the content following this focusing on Survivor players. So I really wonder what's gonna happen here. But we obviously gotta check in on Tori and Sebastian with talk about them getting closer, which immediately raised red flags about Sebastian being in danger. While we then also get a very awkward conversation between Michaela and Chris, where Chris is telling him that people are sketched out by him, and Michaela says that no one's solid with him and that he isn't Survivor strong, which is bizarre as it really comes out of nowhere on the season. And while we have these points, obviously, where like he helps out Josh earlier, the fact that Chris is essentially kind of ostracized from the Survivor group is just really out of left field here. And that adds to the strangeness of this episode, is that we get so much content here revolving around Chris that feels very opposed to his previous content, where really up to this point in the season, Chris was portrayed pretty positively and shown to be a mostly solid player, while here he's portrayed as a massive train wreck with like almost everything going wrong for him here, which was bizarre. But also just, again, out of left field, we get talk about how he has an alliance with Corey, Fessy, Sebastian, and Josh that somehow wasn't mentioned until now. Where again, outside that little moment of him and Josh, we really haven't seen Chris interact with any of these people up to this point. By the way, this does take us to the daily, which ends up being a kind of lackluster one. I mean, there's a part 1 where everyone is jumping on mini trampolines to see numbers on the other side of the wall, to which they have to write down the sum of those numbers. And again, this was just kind of boring to me, though bizarrely the only person to get it on their first try here is Sebastian, which felt kind of random. But anyway, the top 3 men and women move on to stage 2, where they bring in a truck that has a trampoline on it, because that's the challenge of it, thinking that having trucks makes it actually entertaining. And this one in particular felt very dangerous also, where they're literally jumping on a trampoline while on a truck to grab some flags. And we see like Tori getting really bounced around every time she jumps on it, which again, like, how did this make it past health and safety? But really, Tori and Fessy end up being the only ones to do remotely well here, where we do get some funny editing with Michelle missing all of her jumps and Chanel talking about how this game is hers, only for her to also miss all of her flags. But either way, with Tori and Fessy winning here, that's another pair of MTV vets having power, though obviously Fessy, having connections to Big Brother, does want to keep Big Brother safe, and through that target survivors, which does add a different dynamic here. Though we do also finally get content from Bananas of him talking about how there's 0% chance he goes in, only for us to see Fessy openly want to put in Bananas and Wes, but obviously he can't because Tori's there, because Tori has to ruin everything. But again, we see the two agree on who to put in, with Tori wanting to put in Chris as he's the only survivor guy outside Sebastian. Obviously she wants to keep Sebastian safe, while for the survivor women, Tori wants to keep Desi, Michaela, and Chanel safe as she has to deal with them, which leaves Cassidy as the only other person to put in, which does lead to Cassidy being annoyed at Tori as they were roommates, while Chris has this really awkward moment with Fessy talking about how it felt personal to him. But really after this, we get a lot of scrambling that did feel very survivory to me, with there really just being this very fast-paced segment of the player strategizing, where it really mostly revolves around Chris, where we do see the survivor women comparing notes, where we really cut from one conversation to another of them all figuring out that Chris was throwing different names out there, obviously to try to keep himself safe, as obviously he wants a woman to be voted in to keep him from elimination, seemingly being very sloppy play from Chris, which again feels kind of weird considering how much his content on the show is about how he wants to redeem himself strategically after Edge of Extinction. But really, again, the portrayal of this scene though is just very weird, where we do get a lot of flashbacks taking us back to Chris's comments, and we also get this like montage of him doing too much, and again, just really weird how they portrayed this here. But following that, we do get Sebastian talking about how Chris is on one right now, and he's annoyed because Chris is his number one guy, which again, we didn't see until now. What's funny that he says this when he is also getting in trouble for doing too much, where we see Sebastian telling Tori that he wants to take out Corey for some reason, and obviously this plan ends up leaking out to where Corey ends up confronting him about it, to which I will say Sebastian actually does a decent move here in putting the blame on Chris, though Corey ends up kind of seeing through it anyway. But then we have Corey going to Chris and telling him that Sebastian's throwing him under a bus, and we have him campaigning to the vets to vote in a girl, which obviously doesn't end up following through. And this leads to Chris talking about how upset he is and that he feels just like he did on Edge of Extinction, which it's probably the only like kind of redeeming quality of his edit on this episode, where again, like, it is strange how like a lot of the season up to this point he was portrayed super positively, where outside of this moment in a short segment about him talking about his family, it really just feels like this episode's a complete dunking on Chris. But to be honest, again, how much of that was really avoidable considering the circumstances. But anyway, we get to the vote, where despite Chris campaigning campaigning so hard to vote in a woman. He's literally the only person here to vote for a woman, while the rest of the votes end up going pretty much in line with how the last vote went, where the Big Brother side plus a few of the vets end up voting for Sebastian, while the Survivor side of things end up voting for Tyler, with Sebastian being the person picked from the hopper here, essentially guaranteeing that Survivor player will finally go home. What a shocker. And this ends up being kind of a strange elimination, one where they have to set up these platforms and perform a trick shot, getting a ball into a barrel, and again, this didn't really feel very challenging to me, but either way, Chris ends up winning here, unsurprisingly, meaning we lose Sebastian, and Sebastian was there. Again, still one of the strangest casting choices on this season, and again, I don't really feel like he brought that much to the season outside of his relationship with Tori, which, again, didn't particularly like. Now, in terms of Sebastian himself, I don't mind Sebastian as a person. He seems fine, seems affable enough, but just as a reality TV character, he's not the most riveting in the world. I do feel like out of the CBS players that didn't make it far on this season, I feel like he probably brought the least to the table. I also wouldn't be opposed to seeing him again, but I'm also not dying for it either, obviously. Now for episode 10, which probably ends up being one of the more foreshown episodes of the entire season, where almost every single segment in this episode directly involved the upcoming events of the episode, where right away we get to talk about how Chris still not trusted by the Survivor girls. Again, the high focus on Chris made it pretty clear he was going in once again. We then get Josh and Wes talking, with Josh talking about wanting to make his first ever final, and that he's good friends with Wes, but Wes is the strongest guy in the game, which makes it very clear that Josh is going to betray Wes. Anyway, we get to the daily, where instantly we have Tyler talking about how him and Alyssa are on the bottom and they need to win. So I wonder what's going to happen to Alyssa, especially when we get more focus on Tyler's worry about Alyssa than himself. But it's here where we learn that it's a double elimination, as we obviously need to expedite the end game here. To which Cassie then says right afterwards that I don't want to go in again. I wonder what's going to happen. Either way, the daily itself ends up being a pretty standard one of just jumping to a baton. Each jump gets harder. Last one standing wins. We do get some intrigue from the women's side of things, where Michaela is really terrified of jumping, which again got super hyped up in the commercials, though she ends up getting it and ends up winning the challenge, her first individual win ever. So that's something. On the men's side of things, we did get some humorous content from Wes talking about wanting all the power, only for him to then immediately be the only person to miss in the first round. Anyway, it does eventually come down to Fessy versus Bananas, where they end up making a deal to save each other, which kind of made the previous episode of Fessy wanting to target Bananas feel inaccurate, especially considering the later events we see as well. But Fessy ends up winning here. But coming into the nominations, we do end up seeing Michaela talking about how Alyssa and Cassidy aren't threats and they should be going after Tori, to which she's then talked down by Desi and Chanel, considering they're worried that if they put in Tori, that they're going to put in another strong woman against her, which, to be fair, is probably true. But again, that kind of leads to some annoyances with this part of the season, where it really just felt like they were just letting the strong people through, which again is probably optimal gameplay, but it's just not interesting TV. But either way, we get the nominations, where Fessy wants to just put in Chris again, as he obviously voted him in last time. On the women's side of things, they do talk about putting in Tori, only for Fessy to then go on this spiel about how you need to keep the strong competitors in because they're more likely to keep them in the game, which again is just a boring strategy. But either way, they end up voting in Alyssa. Kind of a boring result here. Anyway, follow this with a decent amount of focus on the Tyler-Alyssa relationship, which is still kind of boring, but Alyssa gets personal content talking about starting an animal rescue, which felt about right for her going home in this episode. But then we also get Chris being told that he's up, to which he also gets a bevy of personal content once again, pretty much getting the same content about how he's always tried and it's never been enough and he feels like he needs to prove himself. And again, it just makes it pretty clear at this point to me that he's definitely being set up for a win, which is how much they're hamming home his personal content episode after episode after episode. But either way, this is where we do see the plan that will later go through, be talked about, where we see Chris telling Josh and Michelle that he wants to take on Bananas or Wes, talking about how the Vet Alliance will never break, which is you're talking to two people that are kind of working with the vets. But either way, Josh obviously ends up hamming this up, talking about how he doesn't want to hurt someone who's like a brother to him. And he really ends up getting emotional before putting his vote in. Which, again, Josh has always been an emotional person, but I do feel like this was definitely him trying to ham this up, especially considering the later events of the episode as well. I do feel like Josh was really trying to make a meal of his betrayal here. But also here we do see Cassidy talking about how she hopes the Survivor women don't turn against her, to which we followed up with Michelle voting her in. And we get to the actual votes where, again, she ends up getting 9 votes here out of 12, which means most of the house is essentially against her. So she ends up obviously going in against Alyssa, while on the men's side of things, Tyler gets the most votes with 7, though Wes and Bananas also gets votes, and Wes ends up being the one picked, as obviously. And you get a pretty mundane elimination. I didn't find this one particularly interesting, but it's them swinging around this tower thing and them having to get patches off the opponent. And again, I just felt like it was mostly hard to follow. Cassie ends up winning against Alyssa as expected. And on the men's side of things, Chris ends up winning at the very last second, so that's something. But anyway, Wes and Alyssa are out, and we do actually get some drama on the way out here as well. We get Cassidy calling some of the women out, telling the strong women to send themselves in, which gets hyped up as this like rivalry between Cassidy and Chanel, which obviously culminates later. But also on Wes's way out, we do get some content from him asking Josh who did it, with Josh clearly being emotional in this moment because I'm sure he wanted people to know that he did it. But obviously, Josh says he did it. And again, this is a bit of a tense moment. I did like having a moment like this on the challenge. But anyway, we obviously lose 2 people here. Let's start off with Alyssa, who was fine. I mean, again, Alyssa is a very affable person, but also one that doesn't really bring much to the show outside of just being in a showmance. Again, she had a showmance with Tyler. That's really most of her storyline. Again, I don't dislike Alyssa Snyder, but she's also just not that interesting at TV either. Well, then we obviously got Wes, who is obviously still great TV. I mean, he's pretty much the same as he always has, And again, I thought he made good TV here. I did like his like rivalry with Cassidy. The way he goes out here is a little bit anticlimactic, but I did like the fact that it was Josh that got him out. I think Wes had an interesting role on this season, but as his final season, I think this would be an underwhelming way for him to go. Not because he performed terribly on this season, but more so just because it's USA 2. Like, why is USA 2 his last season? Anyway, I don't fully believe him. I do think he's taking a break. I mean, I think this will be very similar to his stretch from 29 to 32 where he didn't show up there. I personally do expect to see Wes back in a few years, though. If not, at least on something like All Stars or some other series. Again, I don't think this is actually the end of Wes, but it probably is for the short term. Now for episode 11, where we obviously started off with the typical content from Chris and Cassidy and Tyler about being on the bottom, making it clear that they're going to be the focal points of the episode, along with the fact that Corey finally comes back to the show after being pretty invisible for a good chunk of it, where now he talks about how he wants to organize his group, and he ends up having a personal segment of him talking to his family, and again, obviously made it very clear that he was going to play a role here, which with that, we then get to the daily, which ends up being a wrestling challenge where they cover themselves in oil and fight in the ring. And I would say I actually thought this was actually decent TV, even though again they obviously end up objectifying them with them doing slow-mo, them putting the oil on themselves, which was still ridiculous. And obviously, Bananas hams it up as much as he can. But in the men's matchup, we do get really everyone just ganging up on Chris and further making you feel bad for him. But once he's out, Tyler and Bananas end up essentially taking each other out, all while Fessy is just standing in the background watching everyone else fight, which was funny. And Corey ends up taking out Josh, only for Corey to then beat Fessy as well. Obviously, Corey winning this because obviously, I will say something I don't love about this challenge, even though again I thought it was fun to watch, is the fact that obviously it does greatly benefit those in a good position in the game. Obviously, it really disfavors those on the bottom and just incentivizes the current power structure because obviously you can gang up on people no matter how strong you are. 5 guys going against 1 is obviously going to lead to that one person that's outnumbered getting taken out. So again, like, don't love that aspect of the challenge. I feel like the men's version of this really exemplified that more so, though the women's plays out similarly as well, with Tori being an instant target and being taken out, though straight up I didn't feel as bad about Tori. But again, after that, it becomes a bit more of a scramble where we do see Chanel and Cassidy fighting, while Michaela and Michelle end up fighting, and Michaela takes Michelle out, only for then Desi and Cassidy take each other out. And again, it felt a bit more even there, at least, where Michaela was really just fighting against everybody, not really even sticking to her own alliance. But the challenge ends with Michaela beating Chanel and taking the win once again, to where we once again get the exact same content as the previous week, with Michaela wanting to target Tori once again, and we have the exact same debate of Chanel and Desi being upset, being worried that they'll be thrown in. Though, unlike last time, this time it feels like Michaela actually was going to go through with this, where you come into nominations, where Michaela really is dead set on targeting Tori, only for Corey to obviously not be on board, which is, again, lame. And this does lead to an argument between the two, with obviously Corey not being willing to budge on that topic, though Michaela does end up keeping Chris safe in this instance, wanting to work with him down the road, and through that Tyler ends up being voted in alongside Cassidy, with Cassidy being really upset at them for making the easy move, all leading up to a party where Cassidy gets drunk and we get her kissing Michelle, which was funny, really fulfilling this prophecy of By Shell from the Winners at War fake spoilers. But also here we do get Cassidy clearly being drunk while campaigning to Michaela, only for Michaela to not budge, and Cassidy saying that she's kicking her while she's down, leading to this pretty big fight. And again, this was pretty fun. Really feeling like Cassidy just perfectly fits into the challenge world. Really, this does lead to a pretty big battle between two factions here for who gets voted in, where Corey ends up telling Tori about Michaela's plan. This leads to the vets all agreeing to vote in Chris, making it a guy's day, while the Michaela side of things end up wanting to vote Tori in, with them campaigning now for Michelle's vote, who's in the middle, with Michelle finally having to pick a side, which takes us to the elimination where Tori only gets 3 votes, making it pretty clear to the Survivor women that Michelle had betrayed them, which, to be fair, I do think is probably the optimal move for Michelle, as, again, she even states it here that she wants to keep Cassie around because she thinks Cassie is easier to beat later in the game, which, again, for someone like Michelle, who really doesn't really stand a chance against really anybody but Cassidy, it is in her best interest to keep Cassie around, though at the same time, like, you're probably not going to win anyway. So I feel like you might as well make the big move, even though it might not be in your full best interest. But obviously, again, I understand how this affects future seasons, and obviously Tori is going to be part of future seasons where Michelle is going to want to be in her favor, which again is the lame aspect of how the challenge is currently structured. But either way, Chris gets the majority of the votes here and does get voted in, meaning that we get a Chris versus Tyler elimination, where the elimination itself ends up being kind of an interesting one here, it being barrel tag, where we have the typical challenge that we see pretty often of them having to navigate through a field using barrels, though this adds a tag aspect to it of you having to catch up to your opponent, and the one to do so the quickest wins. And I thought it was an interesting concept. Now, in practicality, it didn't really work out that great, as again, I didn't feel like it was that riveting to be, and just straight up it finishes so quickly, where both of them finish in under 2 minutes, and Chris ends up winning pretty dominantly here once again, which again just continues Chris's pretty big underdog run this season. Again, we do lose Tyler, who I like Tyler in BB20. I feel like every iteration we've seen after that has not really been the same. I feel like he's kind of lost this like luster, this cutthroat nature, and I feel like Challenge USA kind of continued that. I really don't feel like we saw too much impressive gameplay here. It really just seemed like he stuck to the Big Brother side of things and didn't really expand beyond that. Even then, at the end of the day, Tyler is the last surviving Big Brother newbie in the game, so at least that's something. But I really don't feel like he brought much gameplay to the table. And again, entertainment-wise, he's still like not the most riveting TV. I think he's usually the best TV when he's kind of the straight man to a lot of these like kooky characters that are around him. And here I don't really feel like he fulfilled that role that well. And again, I just found this relationship with Alyssa kind of boring. So again, didn't really do that much for me on this season, though again, I wouldn't be opposed to seeing him again, as I do think there's a good challenge competitor in him, but again, at the end of the day, not the most riveting TV. Now for episode 12, where we obviously started off with the ramifications of the previous vote, where Michelle reveals to the other Survivor girls that she betrayed them, and this does lead to some strange content here with the Survivor women feeling like they're on a bit of a high horse with some of the language they use against her here, and we have like Tori entering the room and everyone just divulging all their information to her, which was just kind of lame. Again, turning what could have been this like fun confrontational scene between Tori and these women that just betrayed her into just kind of a boring one. I do feel like this episode also made it pretty clear that this is a bit more messy of a move than initially portrayed from Michelle, where it makes it pretty clear that this was Michelle wanting to go for Tori, but like not wanting her name associated with it. So she's let the Survivor girls put their names instead. Again, kind of feeling very similar to a move Teresa did back in Free Agents that really backfired on her. And again, not surprising it backfires on her here. But anyway, during this video, get a lot of focus around Desi with her getting personal content and her talking about how she's upset that she's ruined her relationship with Tori, and gets emotional about how that's not in her character to lie to people. And I mean, like, realistically, I think just suck it up, you're playing a game. But I mean, in context to the editing of the show, I mean, this is obviously trying to make her look more sympathetic. And we do do see her consoling Chris in a following scene, and he ends up pledging her loyalty to her, which I wonder if that'll be relevant. This all obviously takes us to the daily, which is this typical challenge of them running through a fort looking for puzzle pieces and coming back to solve a puzzle, though a really interesting aspect of this challenge is the fact that they don't tell them how many puzzle pieces there are, and this does lead to this really fun result for this challenge where the vets are in the lead for the majority of it. However, think that there's only 7 pieces, only for Michaela to find an 8th. And we get funny content from her lying to Bananas, and we have her instantly telling Chris about it, to where Chris and Desi end up winning the challenge. We do instantly see Michelle and Fessy thinking that they're going in, with Michelle obviously being the main focus here, with pretty much everyone seeming to want to make it a girls' day. But through that, we do get Josh getting content about how close he is to the final, where this continues to get reiterated throughout the episode over and over again, to where again, it felt so heavy-handed to the point where it was pretty apparent that he was going to fall just short. But either way, the Survivor women are pretty dead set on Michelle, with Michaela telling the men that this is where they're going, and proceeds to tell them what Michelle did the previous round, only for Michelle to walk in, and we do get a fun fight between the two. Or do you get Michelle saying a pretty iconic line, and "I'm a mess but not a villain," and we do get a funny response from Michaela saying, "Who said you're a villain?" So that was all really fun, but it does obviously lead up to the nominations, where it's a pretty easy Michelle nomination, with Desi talking about how she wants to right her wrong with Tori and repair her integrity, which, whatever. Before the boys, we do get a bit more debate, where initially they talk about putting up Fessy, though they do end up putting up Josh, which doesn't even fully get explained on the show. I mean, I assume what happened here is that they obviously knew it was going to be a girls' day, and through that, why upset Fessy by nominating him when you could just put up Josh, who's less of a threat. Even if he comes after you, it's like, it's Josh, and that way you're not burning any unnecessary bridges. But to be honest, we really see neither of them truly campaign, where instead we get a lot of content about how Josh and Michelle are extremely close and how he doesn't want to go against her, which again, just kind of comes out of nowhere. I mean, we obviously did see that the cross-network vets were kind of working together, but again, the fact that Fessy outwardly says that Josh and Michelle are his #1 allies did feel a bit out of nowhere. But beyond this, we do get talk from Josh about him once again wanting to prove himself, where he tells everyone the following round to vote him in against Chris, which I'm sure that would have worked out for him. But anyway, we get to the secret vote, where we do get this funny little moment of Bananas eating a banana and then leaving the banana peel on the floor, only for Michaela to eventually pick it up, which I thought was a fun character moment for both of them. But almost everyone ends up voting for Cassidy, and she obviously ends up getting picked here, with Cassidy having a pretty subdued episode as a whole here. But again, Michelle versus Cassidy, pretty clear Michelle's going home based on the editing. But the actual elimination was actually kind of an interesting one, where they both have control of the steering wheel and have to spin it to light up targets with a torch. It involves them having to like overpower their opponent, and I thought this is actually kind of a pretty innovative challenge here. But Cassidy wins pretty easily here, 6-1, where I'm sure we'll never see Michelle ever again. AKA, she literally filmed Challenge 39 immediately after this, which I should say that the fact that Michelle was released as part of the cast of Challenge 39 before this aired is really funny, as it's literally them just spoiling that Michelle doesn't win the season. But either way, we obviously do lose Michelle here, and Michelle was fun on this season. I mean, she has turned into this like very different character, I feel like, on the challenge than Survivor, to where on Survivor she's like the scrappy underdog that's usually pretty measured, but on the challenge, I mean, as she says herself, she's just a bit of a mess, though again, a fun mess. I really like her rivalries with like Amanda and Michaela. She gets into fights, she plays the game hard, again poorly at points, but at least plays the game hard. I think there's a lot to like from Michelle on the challenge. Now, again, do I ever have faith in her to actually win a season? Probably not. I think this is probably the way it goes for her on most seasons, of making it pretty far into the season, but then not quite getting to the end, or she's just simply not really on the level of like the top tier women. But again, I think she's a fun presence on the show, and something that I'm perfectly fine being on most of the seasons that we're seeing recently. Now for episode 13, the penultimate episode, where right away we get a lot of focus on Fessy and Josh, with Josh also talking about needing the money for his family, which I find it funny that he's getting the storyline when he is literally one big brother, which I get that money's not really that much in the grand scheme of things, though it's really funny that of all people that are getting the storyline, it's Josh. But again, this made it pretty pretty apparent what was going to happen on the men's side of things. Well, also here we have Chanel finally being on the show after being pretty irrelevant for a lot of the season. Though I feel like here she actually got some pretty good content, particularly around how she had lost confidence in herself after Survivor and people called her a flop. And yeah, I did genuinely feel for her in this moment. But anyway, we get to the daily, obviously the final daily before the final, to which it gets announced that's a double elimination once again, which obviously, but really this ends up being such a lame daily. Another one that just seems like it's here because they wanted to make everything look cool. Like, oh my God, they're crossing a beam. But it's a challenge that, again, was just so boring to watch and really had almost no substance to it. Really, the entirety of the challenge was climbing up a ladder and then crossing a beam that takes at most 15 seconds. And with it all being based around time, again, there's not real much substance to this challenge. By the way, Michaela is terrified of heights once again, and that gets really focused on, though she does really well here and ends up winning. While on the men's side of things, it's between Chris and Fessy, with Chris barely beating him out. We then get to the nominations, where instantly we see Michaela saying that she wants Cassidy in, as she made a pact with Tori to keep her safe, and she has no reason to go back on her word, which I guess, I mean, ideally, yeah, I would have liked to see her put in Tori, obviously. Though, I mean, I think we're at the point where obviously Michaela's expecting to come back, and her burning Tori in this instance for really just no real reason doesn't really make that much sense, but still a frustrating aspect of the challenge and how people coming back every season does affect how the game plays out. But on the men's side of things, we do see a lot of talk about how Bananas is the biggest target, and through that, they just want to let Bananas go in through the hopper, and instead they vote in Fessy. Which is where we cut back to Fessy, where instantly he calls out that it's going to be Hall Brawl, which to be fair is a pretty good read here. Obviously, we haven't done Hall Brawl all season, and it is this like perfect elimination to save for last. But beyond that, it's kind of funny that you can kind of tell from Fessy's point of view, it's more so who am I going to take out more so than who I'm going to go against, considering obviously him being well known for being good at Hall Brawls. And we do instantly see him want to vote in Bananas, only for Josh to struggle with that due to Bananas being his friend, saying that he'll vote himself in before Bananas, which I don't believe is allowed, as it didn't look like Josh had that option when voting. And this is another aspect of previous relationships impacting the gameplay, though I think this one actually made it a bit interesting, as obviously was this dilemma for Josh of who does he remain loyal to, Fessy or Bananas. And we kind of see Tori have a similar conundrum, where we see her having a deal with Corey and having to pick between Bananas and Josh, where we get this funny little scene of her consoling Josh as she literally tells him that she's voting him in. But anyway, after the voting, we do see Josh admitting to Bananas that he did put his name in, to which we have Bananas obviously being indignant as he always is. But then we get this little humorous hypocrisy from Bananas of him being upset at Tori for voting in Josh, only for him to then say he's shocked Josh voted him in because when you say something, you mean it. Which it's like, this is literally what Tori just did. Why are you upset at Tori for voting in Josh when she's just doing literally what you just said you wanted people to do? Anyway, we get to the elimination where it's Hall Brawl, unsurprisingly, though it is a bit modified here. First up, they do have to utilize shields for the first impact, which screams out to me the fact that they obviously wanted to just avoid injury, as we've seen in previous seasons, particularly in like something like Double Agents, especially considering they clarify that you can drop it after the first impact. But the more lame aspect of this to me ends up being the puzzle at the end. It kind of nullifies the entire point of the Hall Brawl, which I guess they're not trying to make it just such a blowout for the likes of someone like a Fessy to win this challenge, but still, again, it just kind of ruins the point of Hall Brawl. Anyway, on the women's side of things, Chanel gets the most votes and gets picked, leading up to the Chanel versus Cassidy elimination that, again, had been set up for a bit. And strangely here, the puzzle that they end up having to complete is literally the exact same puzzle, and really an easier one, of one that Chanel had to do in Survivor 42 during Sweater Savvy, of just counting up all the shapes. And we do have Chanel beating Cassidy here, obviously ending her winning streak. And I also felt bad for Cassidy here, where she's like sobbing on her way out, where she's like so upset in her confessional all the time, how it reminds her of her loss in Survivor and gets emotional over that. But the men's side of things has Bananas getting the most votes with 5, and Josh to have 2, only for Josh to get put in, with obviously Bananas gloating about how this is karma, biting him in the ass. But anyway, now we have the fabled Fessy versus Josh elimination. Again, who would have guessed? But Josh actually does hold his own pretty well during the Hall Brawl. I mean, obviously, if it was just a regular Hall Brawl, he would have still lost. But again, I thought he held off Fessy pretty well. And we do get an interesting strat from Fessy here in him taking a first look at the puzzle and giving a first guess. But then after that, he just proceeds to guess without looking back at the puzzle, clearly knowing obviously it has to be a number around there, which allows him to get more guesses in. And he does end up beating Josh here, with Josh unsurprisingly getting eliminated right before the final. with, again, the show really hamming up how, oh, Josh shouldn't have turned against Bananas. That was the worst thing he could have done, which is like, that had nothing to do with anything. Obviously, sad elimination for him. But with that, I mean, let's talk about the eliminated players. I mean, we got Cassidy, who, again, I thought had a great run on this season. Definitely one of the big standouts from this season in terms of people I would like to see on the challenge moving forward. I feel like she is a perfect fit. Someone's at least going to try to play the game, while she might not play well in the social strategy aspects. I feel like she still can do really well in eliminations. And she had a good underdog run on this season and does bring some drama. So again, I feel like she's a perfect fit for a challenge moving forward. I would personally like to see her back. Well, then we got Josh, who, again, I also thought was fun on this season. I mean, a lot of people hate Josh out there, and I personally don't really get it. I think he's great TV. Well, yes, he can ham it up a bit too much at points. I still find him to be one of the best reality TV characters potentially of all time. And I think this season just further proved that, along with the fact that he is now somewhat competitive. I mean, even though he gets eliminated right before the final here, I do feel like he's made strides in actually trying to do well in the challenge and getting in good shape. And I do genuinely feel bad for him, the fact that he did all that just to still not even make the final on this season. But I fully obviously expect to see him back in the future, and I think he will eventually get that final. But overall, I do feel like he brought a lot to this season, and is something that I obviously expect to see back again. But now for the finale, which has us going straight into the final. And just in general, this is a very fast-paced finale where obviously they only had an hour to work with, and we know about sections that were cut out. And again, it just very much feels like they were really struggling to fit everything in here. And I think in a way it does kind of harm the impact of this final. But either way, day one here ends up being comprised of 4 trials, where the winner of each of these trials get a 1-minute advantage in day 2, while the losing person loses a minute, and there also being the chance to double down, obviously doubling in case that you win or lose. Like, overall, I felt like this was fine. I mean, like, truth be told, I feel like this was a type of final that just felt kind of watered down, where these individual trials could have just been checkpoints during an actual grander final, but instead were kind of left out and played individually, seemingly because they obviously wanted to tone down the final to not make it overkill like they did last season. Anyway, the first trial ends up being a strength trial of transferring boxes with a sled, to which Corey ends up doubling up here and failing, which might be a trend here, while Chris and Michaela have easy wins here. While we also end up seeing Desi barely beat out Tori, which, again, Tori losing out in the strength challenge, I feel like is kind of embarrassing for her, as she even states herself. But anyway, we then get to the smarts trial, which is a spelling competition, which was lame. And who would have guessed that Corey and Tori aren't good at spelling? Anyway, Bananas and Desi end up winning there. We then get to the skills trial, aka a puzzle of putting pieces in and making sure there's not more than 4 connected at a time. I mean, like, how is this a skill challenge? Again, this was a puzzle. This should have been the smarts trial. I mean, to me, skills is something like the axe throwing that we later see. So I do find it very strange that this is what they chose for the skills trial. But either way, Tori and Fessy win here with a very basic strat of just creating these straight lines, which for some reason everyone else didn't really follow. But here, Desi and Corey come in last, with Corey, again, having come in last in everything so far. And then that leads to the steel stomach trial, which is obviously gross food, to where we obviously get a symphony of gags. Because obviously that's what I want to watch when I watch the challenge, is people puking. Anyway, Bananas and Tori win there, while Chanel and Corey once again come in last. Where again, obviously this was a terrible result for Corey here, and I did feel for him, where he had literally lost every single trial on day 1, which must be really discouraging. And we do come into the final where, again, he's lost 5 minutes. He's 7 minutes behind the leader in Bananas, though he mostly recovers from that. Here we do end up seeing a short scene of them at night, only for us to then cut to day 2, where it turns out that they cut out the entire overnight section, which is funny, as again, it is entirely pointless in my mind. It's something that I don't need to be there. I personally don't find it entertaining, yet I find it funny that even now we've gotten to the point where they don't find it entertaining and decided that was obviously the easiest thing to cut, which again, it is. But anyway, we get to day 2, which is the actual real final, which is a 10-mile trek up a mountain with 3 risk stations along the way. These risk stations being these short challenges that if you win, you get an advantage, which just seemed kind of overpowered, really. I mean, these really felt like the make or break for this entire final, which I don't love that aspect of it, especially when we learn that the last person to Station 3 will be eliminated, meaning that your performance in Stations 1 and 2 are very important. But also we find out that Station 3 is mandatory, which, again, why are we calling it a risk station if there's no risk to be had at it? But whatever. Again, Station 1 ends up being axe throwing, to which the advantage here is that you get to take a shortcut that cuts over a mile, which, again, is a pretty big advantage, to which Tori and Fessy are the only ones to not get it here, through which they obviously both end up being eliminated. Though Fessy's was a bit more interesting in the fact that he did actually reach the second station second, only for it to be revealed that he accidentally took the shortcut, meaning that he had to go all the way back, and again, that obviously leads to him pretty easily getting eliminated there. Either way, then we get to Risk Station 2, which is essentially just balancing rocks on a scale, and getting it right allows them to use an ATV for a mile, which also felt like a massive advantage. Not just breezing through a mile of the track, but also allowing you to rest during that time. Again, it felt pretty overpowered. And also weirdly here, we only get 2 scales being in place, meaning that if those 2 are in use, then you'll either have to wait or decide to just run it, to which we do see Michaela making that choice, which ends up leading to her getting medevaced before the end, which I will say was kind of a disappointing ending to her season. I feel like just competitively, she felt like the front runner coming into this final, and she was pretty much tied with Desi coming into Station 2. So I think for that to be the reason why she gets eliminated here is kind of lame. But anyway, Bananas is the only person to properly fail the risk station here, which again, he comes in third of the men. Who would have guessed? Obviously, that means Corey ends up passing him along the way. But really, from the men's side of things, Chris really just ran away with this final from the very beginning, passing Bananas early on and being far ahead of everyone else, especially considering the final risk station was just kind of boring, of them having to put bricks in order of elimination. And again, it was just kind of a basic challenge that doesn't change any placements. So we obviously end it with Chris coming in first, with Corey making a pretty big comeback and coming in second. Well, then we see Desi arrive, obviously winning for the women. And we get Chanel arriving as the credits are rolling, which was funny. I guess showing you how fast-paced this all was. But again, I thought this was a perfect ending to the season. Chris and Desi winning this season. Again, perfect conclusions. You have Desi, who has this redemption arc for what happened the previous season with Enzo. You had Chris, who probably had one of the most impressive underdog runs in the history of the challenge. Again, this was a very satisfying conclusion for me. So I was very happy about both winners here. Again, I do wish the final was probably a little bit longer. I think this could have definitely been benefited by probably like a 75 to 90 minute episode, where I feel like a lot of the gravitas of the wins here felt a bit stripped away due to the quick pace. But overall, again, I do really enjoy how this season concludes. But with that, let's wrap up the video by talking about my thoughts on the finalists. Starting it off with Tori. And again, Tori was Tori on this season. I don't personally like Tori on the challenge. I think she's boring. I think she plays the game in a really uninteresting way. I think she is also just kind of a dull personality. I personally don't like Tori, but she continues to be on these shows. And again, she was just the same this season. I mean, nothing really changed. Then we got Fessy, who I do kind of feel for Fessy here. I mean, this was definitely a final where it did seem like he had a decent shot. Again, like while Chris was definitely in the lead and was going to win anyway, I think Fessy should have easily come in second here. Again, if it wasn't for his axe throwing, Fessy would have been pretty neck to neck with Chris. And obviously this is after in history of him having some pretty close finals in the past, but I still feel like Fessy is someone that is definitely going to win the show at some point down the road. And really, I feel like this is probably one of his strongest seasons up to this point. Again, winning a whole bunch of dailies, being very well positioned in the game until the very end. And again, a pretty strong final performance outside of the fact that he missed on the axe throwing and went through the wrong path. So again, overall, I feel like Fessy had a pretty decent season here, but obviously it was all for naught. We then get to Michaela, who I thought was a star of this season. I thought Michaela was incredible TV. I think she is someone that I would love to see be a mainstay on the challenge. And she's someone that, again, I also think has a lot of potential to eventually win the show. I mean, I think this was a final that, again, she was neck to neck with Desi. And I do think if it wasn't for the limited amount of scales, I think we very much could have seen Michaela win this season. And Michaela just kind of brings everything I want from a challenge competitor. Again, a good competitor, but also one that can create drama, someone that's willing to get into confrontation, someone that is going to play the game hard. And again, I feel like Michaela brings all of that. So again, I personally really like Michaela on the show. Next, I'm moving on to Bananas. And just like Tori, Bananas is bananas. He was the same. Now, I will say I did like seeing him have to play from the bottom early on. At least that was kind of cool. But outside of that, I mean, it was just more of bananas. I get, like, he's pretty much the same. He was decent competitively this season. I mean, considering him being the oldest person left in the final, I do think he had a pretty solid performance here. But overall, again, just more of the same. Next, I'm moving on to Chanel, who I do find to be a bit of a weird figure on this season, largely in the fact that she felt like she was a bit under-edited across the season. It really felt like Michaela kind of took a lot of the content away from their alliance, with Desi having her own redemption arc sprinkled alongside that, while Chanel was just kind of there until the very, very end. And I do like Chanel. I think Chanel is someone that I wouldn't be that opposed to seeing her play the challenge again, but I don't feel like she was the most riveting character on this season. Now, competitively, I feel like she's just purely competent. I don't feel like she really exceeds in any aspect of the game, but is also just solid all around. She was obviously in a good position for a lot of the game. She didn't have to go to elimination until the very end. Her final performance was, again, just consistently fine. And really just at the end of the day, I feel like she's just kind of middle of the road in like almost every aspect of the show. Next up, moving on to Corey. And Corey was another one that, like, he was just kind of there for a lot of the season. I mean, Corey really didn't feel like he had much to do for the majority of this season. He definitely felt like the vet that was the most purpled on this season. He was really just shown when he was important. Though I will say, again, his final performance I thought was very interesting, where obviously he fails at every single one of the trials, has a massive disadvantage, but still comes in second. Again, that's kind of cool. Outside that, though, I feel like Corey's run in this season was largely unremarkable, just due to the fact that he had like really nothing going on up until the final, never went to elimination. He only was prominent when he won the dailies. So yeah, I really don't feel like Corey did much of note on this season. But with that, let's get into the winners. First up, talking about Desi. And I'm very happy about the Desi win here. I mean, Desi has been my winner pick for 2 seasons in a row now of Challenge USA. So again, I finally got it right. And again, I think Desi performed pretty well in this season. I mean, I will say it wasn't as dominant of a performance as I was kind of expecting, considering how strong she was last season. And obviously she was back for redemption this season. Like, overall, her performance here was just kind of fine. And the likes of Michaela and Tori kind of overshadowed her in dailies for a lot of the season. And Desi really didn't end up being this like massive front runner I was kind of expecting her to be, but she still does perform very well. Again, kind of like Chanel, she's just consistently good throughout the season, does at least win a daily along the way, also wins elimination. Her final performance was just consistently strong. There's not really much to criticize with her finals performance. Like, I feel like Desi just had a consistently solid season here, and considering her last season as well, like, I think Desi is a very strong challenge competitor. Now, again, probably not the most riveting TV. I do like Desi, and I do think she's a rootable person, but again, not bringing much to the actual TV show outside of her redemption story, but still very happy that she finally got the win. But I think we pretty much got what we were going to get out of her from a challenge perspective. And with that, let's wrap it up by talking about Chris, who had an incredible run on this season. Again, knowing Chris Underwood from Survivor, I really did not expect him to have this impressive of a challenge performance, where again, obviously there are flaws to be had strategically and socially. Obviously, he ostracized a lot of people along the way. He made some pretty rash strategic decisions at points, and definitely fault him on that. But from a pure like challenge performance perspective, he had a very impressive run here. I mean, he won the last few dailies. He won 4 eliminations along the way, including one against Wes. He completely dominates the final to where no one was particularly close to him by the end. Again, I feel like this is one of the most impressive rookie performances in the history of the challenge. And while again, I do feel like while this could be a great one and done for Chris, I personally wouldn't mind seeing Chris back, because I think a major difference between Chris and Desi is the fact that Chris is like a very messy player. Where again, Desi is like kind of just the baseline. I think Desi is kind of going to find her group, stick to it. Chris is very chaotic. Chris played this game very frantically, where I do feel like if Chris were to return, again, I feel like we can see that energy again, and I think that would be really fun, along with the fact that, again, I think he could dominate in challenges once again. While Challenge USA is, again, kind of a little bit of a watered-down version of the main show, I do feel like Chris could compete against the best of the best. And I think it would be really interesting to see if we ever get that at some point. But anyway, that is the entirety of the Challenge USA 2, a season that, again, I very much enjoyed. I personally enjoyed this season. While there definitely were some points that were not as strong as others, I think this is one of the best spin-off seasons of the the show, one of the better recent seasons of the show. I mean, I think this is largely in line with the likes of All Stars 2 and Challenge Australia, which are probably the other better recent spin-offs of the show. Well, again, the main series has been kind of bad since War of the Worlds 2 in my mind, and I think this was a solid season. I think there was a lot of really interesting strategic dynamics across this season. I think it was really interesting to see the vets have to play from the bottom early on. I think there were some notable standouts along the way from the likes of Cassidy, Chris, Michaela, Michelle had a really strong run. Wes had a really interesting arc on this season. You had Janae, Paulie, and Amanda who had all interesting early runs. I thought this was a really interesting season of the challenge. I do think the middle kind of lulled for a bit. I think this is a season that probably would have been benefited if it was just a few episodes shorter, but for the most part, I thought this was a pretty solid, mostly consistent challenge season, which again is very rare in the modern day. But there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on the Challenge USA 2. Now, moving forward, obviously, Challenge Battle for New Champion has started. So I guess I'll cover that eventually. We'll see. Beyond that, obviously, with BB25, which is nearing its end, which I'll obviously do a review and play ranking of that. We also have Survivor UK, which is starting up, which don't know when coverage of that show will come out, but it will probably eventually. Obviously, Survivor 45 is going on. Amazing Race 35. Yeah, a lot going on. Stay tuned for videos on all those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.